Okay, this is the last video in today's series. We're going to be looking at styling and config options that we have when we're creating plots using plotly.js. This is another really simple plot that we've created using the X and Y properties and creating a simple marker and line scatter plot. Now, can anyone see a major problem with this plot? If you can't see the problem already, try to tell me what this plot represents. You might have been able to figure this out based on the data that you can see, especially seeing as we have the data presented to us in an array, but there's obviously a lot more detail about this plot that is needed. And I know that you know this if you've been watching Kaz's lectures. So of course the answer is more details, more information. What is the graph showing us? Give me a title. What do my axes mean? We need axes labels. What is my particular trace showing us? Maybe we need some kind of legend, especially if we wanted to include additional series or traces on this plot. So the way that we create the information around our plots using Plotly is known as layout. We need to create an object that has all of those individual pieces of information that we can then pass into Plotly when we create our plot. The way that we do this is to create an additional variable called layout, and inside that variable we can put optionally any of those additional pieces of information that we need, as well as starting to change some of the look and feel of our plots. So let's go through this one by one and see some of the values that we can put inside our layout object. Firstly, a title. And now we can finally start to see what our graph was showing us. This title is representing the overall description of your plot. The title property will take a string value, and that string value then gets placed above the plot and rendered on your page. Another thing we can change in the layout object is the font. So this will change the overall font of your entire plot, and we can change individual sub-properties of that font property like size, font family, and the color of that font. These values are equivalent to the CSS values you would use for changing those same properties. So in the case of size, we have numbers. In the case of the font family, we have a font family name, as well as a fallback font family, which is sans serif in this case. And for color, in this case, we have a named color, but you can easily use hex colors or RGB color codes as the value for that property. As another top level object within our layout object, we have the x-axis. This allows us to change the different properties of that axis, including things like the title, which we can see in this example, but also things like the different increments in the steps between our x-axis values, and many more that you can find in the Plotly documentation. We can see this is also the same for the y-axis, using the y-axis property name, and in this case we've given that a title of the Fibonacci value. A couple more objects that you might want to use are the show legend property. So this show legend property is by default set to true. So if you want to turn the legend off, you could set that to false. And then the legend property, which is its own object, allows us to position and change the style of the legend as well. So this example is placing our legend on the left-hand side of the x-axis, and we are using fractional values here to represent the percentage of where that legend sits in our overall layout. I'll show you what those values mean in the next slide. In terms of actually applying our layout, there's one just very simple thing that we need to do, which is pass the layout object into our new plot function as a third input parameter. So as long as we've created the layout variable with all of the appropriate structure as determined by the Plotly documentation, then all we need to do is pass that variable into our new plot function, and that layout will automatically be applied. So here's an example of those layout features in action. We can see our title now at the top, and I've included an additional series of data to hopefully clear up what this particular graph is showing us. We can see that we've got our X labels, our Y-axis labels to show us this is the number in the series and this is the value of that number. And then we've got our individual series which are referenced in our legend. The legend is moved over to the left-hand side of the X-axis. As I said, the anchor is on the left-hand side. And then by specifying the 0.1 for the X value, we're saying that this legend should be 10% of the way onto our chart from that left-hand anchor point. In terms of the Y value, from the 0 point of the Y-axis, we are at 0.8 or 80% of the height of our graph, which situates our legend in the top left corner. So this is actually sitting inside our plot rather than the default behavior of the legend, which is to sit over on the right-hand side. You can also see in this particular example that we have our font size, which has changed now. That's increased the font size and changed the color of our font to a dark blue. Speaking of color, let's talk about how we can change the color of our lines and markers. Now, this doesn't actually happen in the layout section. This particular style only is applied within the data object itself. So you might remember that we had the marker property when we looked at bubble charts, and we could change the size of that marker in the chart. Also within the marker object, we can change the color of the marker. And as I mentioned before, this is just a color code. So it could be RGB, it could be hex, or it could be a named CSS color. In addition to the marker object, we also have the line object as a property of our plot data. Just like the marker, we can change the color of our line. In this case, we have them being the same color, but you can change them to be whatever you like. You could have differing colors for your markers and your lines. This is an example of what that looks like once we have included the color properties under either the marker or the line properties of our data object. Another quick tangent I want to go on is color scales. Color scales are predefined sets of colors that we can use within our data in Plotly. This particular example is showing us a color scale called Jet. That's a name that has been defined within Plotly. And you can look up the documentation to see all of the other predefined color scales. But where a color scale comes in handy is representing data via colors. So in this case, the data set has been created by Plotly to represent all of the color space of that particular scale. We're seeing in the bottom left-hand corner, the blue, that's the furthest left point of the color scale. And then we get that to ramp up all the way through the green, through the yellow, and eventually to red. So this is just a pretty picture at this point, but where that might come in handy is something like a heat map, which is representing the amount of, say, time that a user has spent with their mouse at a point on your screen. And you can then use the color to represent the additional time that they've spent relative to the rest of the page. So they might have a blue section where they have not moved their mouse and interacted with, or they could have a red section, which could be a button that has received a lot of user input and interaction. That's just one example of how you could use a color scale to represent your data, but there are many, many other ways to use color scales effectively in your plots. Back to the styling. One last thing that I want to show you is the line interpolation options. So these options will be set within the data sets as well. These don't get set in any additional layout or styling options. They get set directly into your data. And we can see the different types of connections that get created between the markers or our data points in the series. So the legend shows us the values that we would want to use inside the different objects in our data set. I'm not going to go through all of these individually, but one that I would recommend checking out is the spline value. So we'll scroll down to see the trace that uses the spline interpolation method. And we can see here that the spline is set up under the line property, and it's under its own property of shape. So the shape property is what determines the interpolation. The value of spline will create smooth connections between your data points, and that's how we would get a nice and smooth line rather than the jagged line that you get out of linear interpolation. The very last thing I want to show you are the config options that you can set for your plot using the config object, which gets passed in as a fourth input parameter to our new plot function. There are a lot of different config options, so I'm only going to show you a few here, but please check out the documentation for all of the other things that you can set. These config options are more general. They're not related to specific pieces of data or series of data. And so this is why they get set up separately as their own object and input parameter into our plot rather than as part of the plot data itself. So 3 config options that I've applied for this example are the responsive property. I've set that to true. That's going to allow our graph or our plot to scale up and down depending on the width of the device that the user is viewing it from. We've got the scroll and zoom property, scroll zoom. We've set that to true. That allows us to use our mouse wheel to actually scroll in and view the data in more detail rather than just the default functionality of selecting an area to see in more detail. Finally, I've set the display mode bar property to false. So this is the bar that would typically appear in the top right-hand corner with all of those options for setting the pan, the zoom, and some of the other interaction functionality of our plot. I've hidden that in case you want to have more of a clean visualization where the user doesn't have as much control over their interaction with it. So when we want to then include that config inside the plot, we add the final config variable as an input parameter, which we set up here, and that will immediately provide the functionality that we want in terms of the configuration. So we can see the responsive working as well. As I hide and show the JS, our visualization scales up and down, but it retains all of the same scaling in terms of the X and Y axes that we've set up based on our data. One other thing to note in this particular visualization is we are seeing 2 types of chart on the same visualization. We're seeing a scatter type and a bar type directly represented on top of each other through our content. Alrighty, that is the end of the Plotly.js tutorial content for this week. I hope you learned a lot about the different ways to not only structure your data for creating different types of charts, but also how to implement that using JavaScript on your web pages. I'll see you in a few more weeks, and we'll be talking about more complex types of data representation that we can do with Plotly, as well as how we can increase user engagement with interaction and animations. Good luck with your next assessment. I hope that this tutorial will put you in a good position to create some really compelling data visualizations. I'll see you guys later.